Have you ever walked away from something? Could be a relationship, a job, maybe even a friendship, and wondered what happened after you left. Like what happened to the other person?
Yeah.
Or maybe you've been the one left behind, like trying to figure out, well, how do I even move on without this person in my life?
Right.
Today, we're going to deep dive into the psychology of walking away. Really going to explore both sides of that experience. Because let's be real, pretty much everyone's been on one side or the other at some point, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's such a universal experience. Like you said, most of us have walked away from something or someone at some point. And definitely, we've all been left behind at some point, too.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because whether we're the ones leaving or the ones left behind, walking away kind of reshapes things, right? Yeah. It changes our relationships and even our own sense of who we are.
Yeah, it does. It's not always something we expect either.
Totally. So for this deep dive, we're drawing on this really insightful YouTube video essay that delves into the whole concept of walking away. One thing that really struck me from the video was this idea that when you walk away from someone, it actually triggers this big shift in their identity.
Yeah.
It's not just like, oh, okay, now my relationship status is different. It goes way deeper than that.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's like a piece of them is missing.
Right. And that makes total sense when you think about how, we're wired as humans. We're social creatures. We're meant to be connected. So much of our sense of self comes from those relationships, those interactions. So, yeah, when one of those really important connections ends, it's like this huge loss. It's not just emotional. It's like you said, a part of ourselves is missing.
Exactly. It's like that feeling of walking into your favorite cafe and automatically ordering for two, even though you're solo now.
Oh, yeah.
It's like your brain hasn't quite caught up to the fact that person's not part of your routine anymore.
It really is. It's like a phantom limb, but for relationships.
That's such a good way to put it. A phantom limb for relationships.
And what's really interesting is that the pain of being left behind, it's not just metaphorical,
Oh, right, yeah.
Research actually shows that social pain, the kind we feel when we're rejected or abandoned, activates the same areas in the brain as physical pain.
So heartbreak literally hurts.
Literally hurts. Yeah.
I guess that explains why we reach for all the comfort food after a breakup. Like our brains are basically treating it like a physical injury, right?
Exactly. Ice cream, chocolate, all the carbs. It's like we're trying to soothe the wound.
Exactly, yeah. And it goes even deeper than that, right? Because remember those feel-good chemicals like dopamine and oxytocin, the ones we get from connection?
Right.
So when we're suddenly cut off from that regular dose of connection, our brain kind of freaks out. It's like going through withdrawal.
It really is. It's like our brain is craving that next hit of connection, that dopamine rush.
And that explains the whole obsessive phone checking, the replaying old messages, all of that. Actually, after one particularly rough breakup, I deleted my ex's number. Just went cold turkey.
Wow, that's hardcore.
It was brutal at first, but I have to say it really did help break that cycle.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like removing the temptation, right? Out of sight, out of mind. But it's not just about the chemicals either. Think about our basic psychological needs. Security, predictability, even self-worth. All of those get shaken when someone walks away. And for some people, it can even trigger those primal survival mechanisms.
Survival mechanisms. I thought those were more like, fight or flight kind of responses, not my boyfriend dumped me responses.
Oh, well, think about it this way. Imagine you're like one of our early ancestors.
Okay, yeah.
If you got kicked out of the tribe, that was basically a death sentence.
Oh, yeah.
You lose access to food, to shelter, protection from predators. It was a huge threat to your survival.
Right. Makes sense.
So even though today's breakups don't usually have those same, life or death consequences, our brains still kind of carry that ancient wiring. So we react with a similar intensity, even if it's not, logically proportionate.
So even though our lives aren't literally on the line, our brains are reacting as if they are. No wonder it feels so catastrophic sometimes. But how does this whole phantom presence idea fit into all of this? It's like even when someone's physically gone, their absence can feel really overwhelming.
Yeah. It's a powerful phenomenon. Basically, the person who's left behind, they often create this whole internal representation of the person who walked away. They might imagine conversations, replay memories, obsess over what went wrong. It's like they're in a relationship with a ghost.
Okay, I get it. So picture this. You're washing dishes, a chore your ex always hated doing, and suddenly you feel their judgment, even though they haven't been in your apartment for months. That's phantom presence in action.
Exactly. And that phantom presence can have a real impact on how someone makes decisions, processes emotions, even how they see themselves. It can be so hard to move on when that internalized version of the person is still so present.
It's like you said earlier, a piece of their identity went missing with that person.
Yeah.
And they're trying to fill that void. But isn't it interesting how this whole experience might be perceived so differently across cultures.
Oh, absolutely. In individualistic cultures like here in the West, walking away might be seen as a sign of independence, maybe personal growth. But in more collectivist cultures, it could be viewed as this huge betrayal of community, of family. The act itself is the same, but the cultural lens totally changes how it's understood.
It's a good reminder that there's no one-size-fits-all when it comes to understanding the psychology of walking away. And then, of course, we've got to throw in the curveball of the digital age, right? How does this whole dynamic play out when the person you've walked away from, or who's walked away from you, is still constantly visible online?
It's like phantom presence on steroids. In the past, when someone left, there was this clean break. You didn't see them at the grocery store. You didn't hear about their new life through mutual friends. But now, with social media, it's like they're perpetually present, even when physically absent.
It's like that feeling of being ghosted, but knowing they're out there, living their best life, maybe even with someone new, and you're seeing it all in high definition.
Yeah.
That's got to make it so much harder to move on.
Definitely adds a layer of complexity. And it raises all these new ethical questions, too, about how we manage our online presence after a relationship ends. Is it ever okay to block someone, to unfollow? There's no easy answer, but it's something we need to be more mindful of, especially as our lives become even more intertwined online.
It makes you wonder if that constant digital access actually delays healing, makes it harder to process the loss. But amidst all this talk of pain and heartbreak, the video essay also points to something really surprising: the potential for positive transformation after someone walks away.
It might seem counterintuitive, but it's this well-documented phenomenon called post-traumatic growth. Adversity, including the adversity of being left behind, can actually be a catalyst for incredible personal growth.
That's a hopeful thought, isn't it?
It is.
It's like the wound itself becomes this doorway to a deeper understanding of ourselves.
Right.
But I imagine that kind of growth isn't automatic. It must take a certain mindset to turn heartbreak into something positive.
You're absolutely right. It's not about toxic positivity or pretending the pain isn't real. It's about actively choosing to frame the experience as an opportunity for learning and growth. The person left behind has to do the work of meaning making, of integrating the experience into their larger life.
So it's not just about what happened, but how you choose to interpret and understand it. That's a powerful idea. It means even in the midst of loss, we have a certain degree of agency in shaping how the experience ultimately affects us.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that even though we can't control someone else's decision to walk away, we can control how we respond and how we allow that experience to shape us moving forward.
That's a great place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground already: the science of heartbreak, the phantom limb of relationships, the cultural and digital nuances of walking away.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to continuing this deep dive in part 2. There's still so much to explore, especially when it comes to the ethics of walking away, the challenges of finding closure, and the very real possibility of post-traumatic growth.
Definitely a lot more to unpack.
Sure.
Welcome back. We're continuing our deep dive into walking away. And this time, I think it's important to switch perspectives a bit. We've talked a lot about what it's like to be the one left behind, but what about the other side of the coin, like the psychology and the ethics of being the one who actually chooses to walk away?
Yeah, that's really important to consider because as we've seen our departures, they have this ripple effect. We don't walk away in a vacuum, Our actions impact other people, even when those actions are, necessary or for the best.
Absolutely. And the video we're discussing, it makes this really interesting distinction between clean and messy departures.
Yeah.
Can you kind of unpack that a bit more? Like, what does that actually look like in real life?
Sure. So a clean departure, it really prioritizes honesty, clarity, and even a degree of closure, even if it's painful in the moment. So for example, imagine someone's in a long-term relationship and they realize it's just not working anymore.
Okay. Yeah.
A clean departure might involve having that difficult conversation, like really being honest about the incompatibility and making a conscious effort to separate in a way that minimizes unnecessary hurt.
So it's not about avoiding pain altogether, but about like being responsible with how you deliver it.
Exactly. Because the pain is going to be there regardless. It's more about how you handle it. And then in contrast, a messy departure is characterized by things like ghosting, manipulation, maybe even cruelty. That's where you see people disappearing without explanation or stringing someone along or just intentionally inflicting pain as they exit the relationship.
Right. And I can see how those messy departures would make it so much harder for the other person to heal and move on.
Yeah, for sure.
It's like being left with this puzzle you can never solve.
Yeah, it's like a wound that can't properly close.
But isn't honesty sometimes just brutally painful?
Yeah.
Are there ever situations where a more gradual disengagement might actually be kinder?
That's a really good question, and it really highlights how complex these situations are. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer.
Right.
But I do think it's important to remember that even when we're motivated by good intentions, avoiding those difficult conversations can actually cause more harm than good in the long run.
Yeah, it's like ripping off a Band-Aid, right? Like that quick, clean break. It might hurt intensely at first, but it allows for faster healing. But this whole idea of ethical departures, it becomes even more complicated when you factor in things like power dynamics, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. So imagine a boss leaving a company, or a mentor ending a relationship with a mentee, or even a parent walking away from a child.
Oh, wow, yeah.
The impact of that departure is magnified because there's this inherent power imbalance in those situations.
There's a greater sense of responsibility to the people who rely on you. Yeah.
Exactly. Leaders, mentors, parents, anyone in a position of influence, they have this heightened ethical responsibility to really consider the impact of their departure and to minimize harm whenever possible.
So it's not just about their right to leave, but also their responsibility to the people they're leaving behind. But how much control do we really have over how someone else reacts to our departure?
Right.
I mean, isn't there a limit to how much we can manage their feelings?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think it's a very slippery slope to try and control someone else's healing process. It can actually be disrespectful because you're denying their right to feel their own emotions and to process the loss in their own way.
So even with the best intentions, walking on eggshells to avoid upsetting someone could totally backfire.
Exactly. It's like you're saying their feelings aren't valid. An ethical departure really acknowledges the limits of our responsibility, but it also takes seriously the impact of our action. It's about being honest, compassionate, but without taking on the burden of dictating someone else's emotional journey.
It's such a delicate balance to strike. And as we've mentioned before, this whole dynamic gets even trickier in the age of social media. How do you ethically walk away when the person you're leaving, or who has left you, is just a click away? Like they're perpetually present online.
Right. This is where things get really interesting because the digital world has blurred the lines between presence and absence. You can ghost someone but still see their Instagram stories. You can block them but still have mutual friends who share up.
Yeah, it's like you can never fully escape that digital phantom present. It makes me think of a friend who was going through a breakup, and she was constantly tormented by her ex's social media posts. She knew she should unfollow him, but she couldn't resist the urge to check in and see what he was up to.
That's such a common struggle. And it really raises new ethical questions. What are the boundaries of online behavior after a relationship ends? Is it ever okay to block someone, to unfollow? I don't think there's an easy answer because it really depends on the specific dynamics of the situation.
Right. It feels like there's this whole new etiquette guide we need to write for navigating breakups and departures in the digital age.
Totally.
But even with all of these challenges, I'm curious to kind of circle back to this idea of post-traumatic growth.
Yeah.
We talked about it earlier from the perspective of the person left behind.
Yeah.
But can the one who chooses to walk away also experience this kind of growth?
Absolutely. Choosing to walk away from something significant is rarely easy. It often involves facing difficult emotions like guilt, doubt, and a fear of the unknown. Navigating those internal struggles and making a conscious decision to prioritize your own well-being, it can be incredibly challenging.
Oh, yeah.
But it can also be this profound opportunity for growth.
So even though walking away might be the right decision, it doesn't mean it's easy or painless.
Right. It can be a real test of courage and self-awareness. It requires you to confront your own needs, to challenge your comfort zones, and sometimes even to disappoint other people. But working through those challenges can lead to a much deeper understanding of yourself, your values, and what you truly want out of life.
It's like you're stepping off a well-worn path and venturing into uncharted territory.
Exactly. And that journey, while it can be scary, it can be incredibly rewarding. It can lead to greater self-confidence, a clearer sense of purpose, and even a stronger ability to form healthier relationships.
So even though we often associate walking away with loss and heartbreak, it can also be a catalyst for positive transformation for both the person who leaves and the one left behind.
Yeah, it's not just a one-sided thing. Walking away isn't inherently good or bad, you know?
Right.
It's this complex act with so many factors influencing its impact. And understanding those complexities can really help us navigate these transitions with greater awareness, compassion, and ultimately the potential for growth on both sides of the equation.
And that's where I think the importance of closure comes in. You know, we often hear about how crucial closure is for healing.
Right.
But what does that actually look like, especially in the context of walking away?
That's a great question because I think we often have this misconception that closure comes in this neat little package.
Yeah.
Like a final conversation, a heartfelt apology, a clear explanation for why things ended.
Like the perfectly scripted ending to a romantic comedy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But in reality, closure is an internal process. It's a shift in perspective that allows us to move forward without being tethered to the past.
So it's not necessarily about getting answers from the other person, but about making peace with the situation within ourselves.
You got it. Sometimes that peace comes from accepting that there will always be unanswered questions, loose ends we can never tie up neatly.
That can be a tough pill to swallow, especially for those of us who, really crave certainty and resolution. But I can see how letting go of the need for everything to be perfectly explained, that can be incredibly freeing.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that life is messy, relationships are complex, and sometimes the most powerful form of closure comes from simply surrendering and trusting that even in the absence of a clear resolution, we can still find a way to move forward and create a new chapter in our lives.
I love that. It's a reminder that we don't always need answers to heal. Sometimes letting go of the need for answers, that is the answer itself.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And I think that's a great place to pause for part of our...
We've covered a lot of ground. The ethics of walking away, the challenges of closure in the digital age, and that surprising potential for growth, even in the midst of difficult departures.
Yeah. And in part 3, we'll explore the possibility of reconciliation, power of forgiveness, and that fascinating science of memory reconsolidation that you mentioned earlier.
It's amazing how our brains can actually rewrite even the most painful memories over time. Until then, listeners, we invite you to kind of sit with these ideas and consider your own experiences of walking away and being left behind. What lessons have you learned along the way? And how might those lessons guide your future step? All right, welcome back to our final chapter in this deep dive, exploring all the ins and outs of walk. We've talked about the science behind heartbreak, the ethics of leaving, even those digital ghosts that kind of haunt our breakup. But there's still so much to uncover, right? Like those big questions that stick with us long after someone's gone from our lives.
Absolutely. Yeah, we often wrestle with things like the possibility of getting back together, the whole forgiveness thing, and even how our memories of these departures shape us over time, all really crucial aspects of understanding the long-term impact of walking away.
For sure. So let's start with reconciliation, like getting back together. That word carries so much weight, especially after a painful separation. Is it ever truly possible, to rebuild that connection after someone has walked away, or some bridges just burned beyond repair?
Yeah, I think that's a question that has probably crossed all of our minds at some point.
Oh, absolutely.
And while there's no easy answer, I think the research does give us some clues, like some key factors that make reconciliation more likely.
Okay, I'm all ears. What are those magic ingredients for a successful reunion?
Well, first and foremost, there needs to be real, genuine accountability from the person who walked away.
Okay, yeah.
They need to own what they did, acknowledge the harm they caused, and really demonstrate a willingness to change the behaviors that led to the split in the first place.
Yeah. So it's not just about saying I'm sorry. It's got to be about showing real change.
Right, exactly. Words are important, but actions definitely speak louder. The second thing that's crucial is that the conditions that led to the departure, those have to have changed, like fundamentally changed.
Gotcha.
So this could be about personal growth, like each person doing the work to transform themselves, or maybe it's a shift in external circumstances, things outside the relationship that were creating conflict or tension.
Okay, yeah. So maybe there were some communication issues that they've addressed through therapy, or some big stressors like a job loss or a family crisis that have resolved. Like those kinds of shifts could lay a more solid foundation for rebuilding the relationship.
Exactly. And then finally, there needs to be enough healing time. Both individuals really need the space to process their emotions, grieve the loss of the relationship, and do the work on themselves to move forward in a healthy way.
Right, because rushing back into something before those wounds have healed, that's probably just setting everyone up for more pain down the road.
Yeah, exactly. It's like trying to build a house on a shaky foundation. It's not going to last.
It's a good metaphor.
Yeah.
So even when all those pieces are in place, the accountability, the change conditions, the healing time, there's still that big question of forgiveness, right?
Right.
It's a word that just carries so much weight, so much emotion. I think a lot of people struggle with what forgiveness actually means, both for themselves and for the person who hurt them.
Yeah, it's true. And I think there are a lot of misconceptions about forgiveness floating around out there. Like some people think it's about saying what the other person did was okay or minimizing the pain they caused. But that's not really what it's about.
Right. So it's not about letting someone off the hook for their actions.
No, not at all. Forgiveness at its core is really for the benefit of the person who's doing the forgiving. It's about releasing that grip that hurt and resentment have on your own well-being. It's that conscious choice to move forward without being weighed down by the past.
It's like breaking free from those chains of anger and bitterness, even if the person who hurt you never owns up to their actions or apologizes.
That's a powerful way to put it. And the beautiful thing about forgiveness is that it's an inside job, you know? It's an internal process. You don't have to wait for an apology or an explanation to choose forgiveness.
Right.
You can start that process on your own time and do it for your own well-being.
Like reclaiming your own emotional freedom, no matter what the other person does. But even when we understand the power of forgiveness and we're really committed to healing, I think it's important to remember that letting go, it rarely happens in a straight line.
Oh, absolutely. I think we tend to picture grief and healing as these linear processes. Like there are clear stages we move through in order until we reach resolution. But in reality, it's so much more complicated than that.
Yeah, it's like that classic model of the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, then acceptance.
Yeah.
It makes sense on paper, but life doesn't often unfold in such a predictable way.
Right. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who developed that model, she always emphasized that those stages aren't meant to be a rigid frame. People experience grief in so many different ways, and those emotions, they can come and go, ebb and flow over time. You might feel like you've totally moved on, only to be hit with a wave of sadness or anger months or even years later.
So it's totally normal to kind of circle back through those emotions, to feel that pain again, even when you thought you had left it behind.
Oh, for sure. And that's where this fascinating concept of memory reconsolidation comes in. You know, it turns out that our memories, they're not these fixed, unchanging things.
Okay.
They're actually being rewritten every single time we recall them.
Wait, so every time we think about a past experience, we're basically editing the memory.
Yeah, in a way. And that rewriting process, it can actually change the emotional content of the memory over time. So that sharp, intense pain of being left behind, it can gradually soften and become a more integrated part of your life story.
So like a well-worn path, the memory becomes less jarring, less likely to trip you up.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And what's even more fascinating is that the memory itself, it can actually become a source of strength and wisdom as you gain new perspectives and insights over time.
It's like that saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. But in this case, it's not just about becoming stronger. It's about the memory itself transforming, becoming less about pain and more about resilience.
Exactly. The experience itself doesn't change, but how you relate to it, the meaning you give it, that can totally shift over time. And that actually brings us to one of the most profound takeaways from this whole deep dive, the idea that some relationships, they actually achieve their fullest meaning through their ending.
It's a bittersweet thought, right? That sometimes letting go is the most meaningful act of love.
It is. It makes me think of that quote by Rumi, the poet, "The wound is the place where the light enters." Sometimes the ending of a relationship, however painful it is, it creates space for something new, something unexpected to come in.
It's like closing one chapter so a whole new story can.
Exactly. And I think that's a really powerful note to end on. Walking away, it's not inherently good or bad. It's complicated, shaped by so many factors. And the more we understand those complexities, the better we can make choices that honor our own needs and the needs of people we care about.
Absolutely. Well, as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of walking away, I want to leave our listeners with this. Every experience, whether it's choosing to stay or choosing to leave, it offers us a chance to learn and to grow.
Beautifully said. And by exploring these experiences with curiosity and compassion, we can gain such a deeper understanding of ourselves, our relationship, and this ever-evolving tapestry of human connection.
So well said. Thanks for joining us on this journey. Until next time, keep diving deep.